Welcome to the Valley of God. We're in one of the only habitable plateaus here, with a mix of savanna and jungle, and the terrain not ludicrously steep. The villagers' great forefathers were not of a village. They trekked unbelievable and epic distances across the Coco mountain range as gatherers, recruiting iron golems from ruins they found to protect them from the evil forces that would come out at sunset. These primitive people would never quite stay in one place, as the area they were inhabiting would always run out of food and other resources eventually. However, with the advent of agriculture, gatherers could finally settle down and begin their first steps into civilization, into villagers. The first settlers here would use bamboo and leaves to construct shelter, just as they had learned to do for thousands of years. These villagers are called the Rolanti, a people native to the Coco mountain range. Once shelter was found, a farm would be established right in the basin of the plateau, and as night passed, the first great iron golem would find its way into the settlement. The village was to be called Faliambombu, but not all could agree with the vision the village's grandfather had set. Some wanted the village to be built inside the Mrshwapa jungle, where they felt they belonged. However, the two groups could not reach an agreement, so they decided to break away with their own version of Faliambombu. Two villages and two peoples. One would be known as the Yunglia Rolanti, the other as the Safania Rolanti. As darkness blankets the land once more, some villagers opt to stay awake, sharing tales betweenst each other, while the iron golem keeps them safe. At sunrise, the Yungli get to work establishing their own farm, and while the Safani are content with their small one-house settlement, some Yungli villagers begin a tradition of primitive craftsmanship, carving and stripping bamboo into something more appealing and practical. The first experimentation with this new technology is a renovation of their home. Stripped bamboo now served as floorboarding for their beds. Not only is it more cozy and comfortable, but it's important for jungle critters to not get into the shelter undetected. The Safani also set up their own craftworks, but it's much smaller in scale, and the savannas are a lot less rife with wildlife, so it isn't a massive necessity to get floorboarding. Another thing that the Yungli struggle with is critters eating their supply of hay. So with some thought, the villagers decide to not only store their hay in the savanna, but construct an elevated building to store that hay in. In a few months, it had been complete. It was the first primitive granary and building ever built. It was elevated and mostly closed off, except for two small windows so sunlight could get in so you could see. It was designed as such to keep rodents away from the crucially important food supply. Now, the Safani were deep in the religious practice, the Tridenna, a gift from God that had captured the sun between its fork, now spreading harmony and warmth to whomever nears it. It was the religion of Sanskrit, and it was one of the study of contentment and being one with nature. The Yungli had their own religion too, but it was much more reserved, as it was about the celebration and worship of their bamboo, which was everywhere, so there was no real need to create any item of worship. It was called Bambuascript. Bamboo was the building block of their civilization, so it isn't a surprise that they cherish it so much. Now, while Faliambombu was growing, tensions had also been growing between the two tribes quite a bit. The two had separate religions, way of life, and level of tech and growth. While the Yungli were more advanced, their population was actually decreasing, getting killed in the merciless jungle they had made home. The Safani were fine, on the other hand, their population actually increasing. The chieftain of the Yungli, Zazwana, seeing this with his paranoid mind, felt that eventually the Safani would grow over the Yungli, and that the enslavement of his people was then inevitable. He convinced his village of this, and so he and his people decided to strike first. The battle was fought with wooden clubs and rocks, and many Safani had died, only 3 having survived and being forced into slavery. Sanskrit monuments were destroyed, and to stop iron golems from spawning and to kill any teamwork between villagers, they were all forced into separate, single-bed shelters. And lastly, a wall was established between the two peoples. With power consolidated in Zazwana's hands, he turned to a clearing inside the jungle. Capitol Hill would serve as the center of government in Faliambombo. It was quite deep in their home of jungle, and the trees served great protection should something go wrong. The servants and guards would be housed in a small communal building, protected from any hostile wildlife. Chieftain Zazwana's manor, though, that was going to be a colossal building. High up in the air, as the height of a building was a sign of status in Yungli culture. Now, as Capitol Hill was established, the Yungli population had actually been growing too. The same slaves who had built the hill were now sent to the farms, and were tasked with expanding it to feed the new mouths of the village. A pasture would also be built around the pigs and sheep in the Tonga Basin. Aki, the man responsible for the farming and livestock in Faliambombo, would propose an expansion of the village into the Tonga Hill. The pasture would bring a lot of people to the area, and the stone deposits with undiscovered ores in them could potentially yield interesting advancements. It took a lot to convince Zazwana to allow the expansion. He set the condition that he would be the mayor of Tonga once it was built, not Aki, and Aki reluctantly agreed to it. It was the beginning of a new arc in the village's lore. While the Safani slaves worked away under the hot sun in the basin, the expansion into the hill would prove to be another existential crisis for Chieftain Zazwana, eventually. In a couple of months, Tonga had been built. Not to fall behind to Aki's accomplishments, Zazwana would finally have someone take down a tree, something that Rolanti have never done before. But the entire area had to be cut down for space for a whopping 3 buildings to be constructed next to each other. It was to be called the Hayfield neighborhood. Zazwana was clearly not looking to be outdone by Aki. It was a game of politics between the two. Aki knew he wasn't technically mayor of Tonga, but de facto he was. Everyone there saw him as the true mayor. And Aki knew Zazwana well, serving as his Hay chieftain. With every month, the old Zazwana was growing more and more superstitious and fanatic about Bambwa script. He and his religious sycophants were not looking out for their villagers. They were fueled more by religious fanaticism and wanted to create a society of radical followers who would follow Zazwana's every word. But Yungli, outside of Mishwapa, had become more liberal and forward-thinking than their counterparts. Of course, this was all a threat to Zazwana's reign. Aki would be replaced by Rifi in regards to farming. Tensions between Aki and Zazwana were increasing, and so it was a good idea to not have him in control of farming. But it only gave him more time to rally his followers in Tonga, surging his support not only there, but in the Hayfield neighborhood. In the meanwhile, Rifi had expanded the entire plateau basin, capitalizing on a recent population boom in the Safani, but also creating more separation between the slaves and free farmers. On the other hand, the capital now had to allow no more than 2 beds in Safani shelters, which was quite a good step towards Safani emancipation. Though the leadership had no intention of ever freeing their slaves, and they were still treated quite brutally, even more so with Hay Chieftain Rufi in control. He was deathly loyal to Zazwana, so there was no chance of food being weaponized against Capitol Hill. On Tonga Hill, Aki begins construction of 3 new buildings, more than doubling the size of the neighborhood. It's all done without the okay from Chieftain Zazwana. Seeing this outside the window of his manor, he becomes enraged and sends 2 soldiers and an iron golem into Tonga. But the people of not only Tonga, but Hayfield neighborhood fight back alongside their community iron golem. Nothing violent happens, though, but Zazwana can clearly see his grip on Faliambombo slipping. Hay Chieftain Rufi orders a new granary to be built, as Plateau Basin had gotten quite big at that point, but it served also to not have one point of failure in the storage system. And while all of this is happening, a secret bamboo workshop hidden behind the trees of the slave land has finished building pillars and floorboarding. The Safani take advantage of the turbulent and tense times, and rush to build their old home anew at sunset. Surprisingly, they got off with only some beatings and the house intact. The new home, beautiful and comfortable. It's yet another step towards Safani, freedom, and Tonga Hill, which had in the past been neutral towards the practice of slavery in Fali and Bombu, was now beginning to show support for the enslaved peoples, though quietly. Next up, a curious, strong villager and Aki would both lead the primitive quarry project in the Tonga deposits. Cobblestone would be extracted and inspected, while getting through to the copper would prove impossible for now. It proved to be a great investment, as man had searched for millennia a way to light fire and shelter for warmth, light, and to cook food. The furnace had just been invented, and it served to cook meat, bake bread, and potentially be able to work ores. Very quickly, many other types of furnaces were created, such as the smoker, which enabled the butcher to cook meat in large quantities very quickly. This area of the village would come to be known as Smoke Field. However, tensions were rising very, very fast, to a point it hadn't been seen before. The chieftain Zazwana, seeing Tonga Hill harness the power of stone, was an incredibly frightening thing. Just as the Safani a decade ago were left behind in Tek and were devoured by the Yungli, it would seem the same was going to happen to Capitol Hill, at least in Zazwana's eyes. With fights breaking out between Zazwana's soldiers and Aki's villagers, small walls were built to aid at least some in defense. But the breaking point of it all would be in the first blast furnace being constructed. It took months of work, but it was very much worth it, as copper was now able to be bent and worked into weapons and tools. Seeing this massive chimney in the distance, Zazwana decided he had had enough of Aki's insubordination. Almost all of the capital's manpower would be sent to Tonga Hill, including 2 iron golems. While the 5 soldiers kept the population at bay, capital golems would destroy Tonga's golem and then move on to destroy the blast furnace, smoke field, and bury the quarry in dirt. The blast furnace was pushed off the side of the valley, making it impossible to retrieve. It was practically a civil war at that point. Zazwana could have easily killed all Tonga residents if he so wished, but he had plans to enslave the population instead of simply slaughtering them. During the cover of night, multiple massive walls would be built by the Safani slaves, slicing the already divided village into an even more divided and tense settlement. During all of this, Aki and his villagers were watching it all unfold in front of them. They knew their day would soon come, just as the old Safani had, so they began mobilizing and preparing for battle. At night, a messenger was sent on a treacherous and dangerous path to the Safani slaves, but it was a success, and the Tonga learned that the Safani were preparing their own rebellion too, and had been apparently promised more rights from the capital if they supported and went along with their plans. The Safani decided not to trust the chieftain, but they were also demanding freedom from Tonga in exchange for help in the upcoming battle. They didn't quite trust Aki, who used to be a chieftain ruling over them, as his treatment wasn't the best, but he was a lot more trustworthy than Zazwana, so they agreed to go forward with them. Today would be the day. The capital had built a small outpost and tower to house their soldiers, but as an iron golem had appeared in Tonga Hill and was ready to fight for the people, the villagers took up arms and their militia would begin approaching the wall. The tower would be felled by the golem and the soldiers guarding the camp killed. Capital reinforcements would be ambushed by the Safani, who in turn would be crushed, killed and thrown around by a golem. Many slaves would die. The slave farmers would attack the free farmers too, killing them, while one of the free farmers would set their granaries and fields ablaze under orders from the chieftain. As the Tonga golem met the 2 capital golems, they would all perish in the battle, the militia having dealt the final blow to the last capital golem, clubbing its head into a dead, dented mess of metal. A fire was set to the Yungli's first home, and Chieftain Zazwana, along with Hei Chieftain Rufi, were stuffed into the servant house and burned alive inside of it. After that, the fire spread. Capitol Hill was no more. All burned down. And as far as they knew it, it might stay that way forever. The true granaries that were storing food were gone. But thankfully the fields did not share the same fate. There wouldn't be too many mouths to feed anyways now. And lastly, all walls were gone. The people of the Safan and Tonga were now free. And it would leave only Aki to lead all Rolanti forward. It was the dawn of a new era for the plateau.